My dad destroyed my pre-med acceptance letter and cut me off. 15 years later, they came begging for help, and my quiet response shattered him with regret. My name is Ethan Johnson. I'm 18 years old, and I was born into a family that looks perfect from the outside and rots from the inside. My father, Robert Johnson, used to be a top surgeon until a single mistake took the life of a 14-year-old girl. He lost his medical license, his reputation, and whatever humanity he had left. He's been bitter ever since, hiding his shame behind arrogance. My mother, Margaret, acts like everything is fine. She keeps the house spotless, hosts her charity luncheons, and smiles like the past never happened. Her denial is her armor. Then there's Daniel, my older brother, 21, the golden boy. He's in law school, well-spoken, smug, and confident. Everything my father wanted me to be. He wears that approval like a crown. And then there's me, the quiet one, the watcher, the one they all underestimate. A week ago, I got the letter that was supposed to change everything. Acceptance into North Park University pre-med program, full scholarship. It was the first thing in my life I'd earned completely on my own. No connections, no family name, just work. For 7 days, I kept that letter hidden under my mattress. I read it every night until I had the words memorized. Dear Mr. Johnson, we are pleased to inform you. I didn't tell them right away. I knew how they'd react. My father hated medicine. The word itself was poison in our house. But hope can make you stupid. I still believed that maybe, just maybe, this would make him proud again. Dinner that night was like every other. Expensive food, the dining room too bright, the air too still. My mother placed the dishes with practiced grace. My father sat at the head of the table, scrolling through the news on his tablet like he still mattered. Daniel was talking about some mock trial competition he'd won. I waited until they were halfway through the meal. My hands were sweating under the table. I could hear the ticking of my father's watch. Finally, I said, I got into North Park University. My mother looked up, polite smile. That's wonderful, dear. What program? Pre-med, I said. Forks froze midair. My father's tablet slipped from his hand and hit the table with a dull thud. Daniel chuckled under his breath. My father leaned back, eyes narrowing. Medicine? His tone dripped with disbelief. You think that's something to celebrate? I earned a full scholarship, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. I want to become a doctor. He laughed, sharp and joyless. A doctor? You think I'll let another Johnson walk that cursed path? You'll end up just like me, disgraced and humiliated. Daniel grinned, slicing his steak. You should study law. You're better off memorizing rules than pretending to save people. I ignored him. Dad, what happened to you was a tragedy, but that doesn't make medicine evil. You made one mistake. Enough, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The glasses rattled. You think you understand what it's like to hold a life in your hands and lose it? You think you can carry that weight? I can try, I said quietly. My mother whispered, Robert, please. But he was already standing, his face flushed red, voice shaking with fury. You won't waste your life chasing ghosts, he said, pointing at me. I forbid it. I pulled the folded envelope from my pocket and placed it on the table. You can't forbid who I am. He grabbed it, tore it straight down the middle, and threw the pieces across the table. Then you're no son of mine. For a moment, I just stared at the shredded paper scattered across the white tablecloth. I felt something inside me go completely still. Daniel leaned back, smirking. Guess you'll need a backup plan. I stood slowly, my chair scraping the marble floor. You didn't lose your license, Dad, I said, voice steady. You lost your courage. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Get out, he finally said. You walk that path, you walk out of this house for good. I didn't hesitate. I went upstairs, packed a bag, clothes, a notebook, my wallet, and found the torn halves of my letter. I folded them carefully and slid them into my pocket. When I came back down, my mother was crying quietly into her hands. Daniel didn't look up. My father stared out the window, jaw locked. None of them tried to stop me. Outside, the air was cool and heavy. I walked down the driveway, past the polished cars, past the glowing windows. The mansion looked like a shrine to everything false, expensive, empty, untouchable. At the gate, I stopped under the streetlight and opened my hand. The two halves of the letter fluttered in the wind like dying wings. They can tear the paper, I whispered, but not the dream. Then I kept walking, away from the noise, the lies, and the name that had always been more burden than pride. That was the night the Johnson family lost their younger son. I walked out that night and came back only to pack. 3 days later, I found a studio apartment on the edge of downtown, a single room with peeling paint, one window, and a bathroom door that didn't close all the way. I had no plan, no savings, and no one to call. Rent was cheap, and that was all that mattered. The days blurred together fast. I washed dishes at a diner from 5 to midnight, cleaned offices on weekends, and picked up tutoring shifts at a local library for extra cash. It wasn't much, but it kept me fed and kept the lights on. Every time I looked at the torn letter taped above my desk, it reminded me what I was working toward. I hadn't spoken to my family since the night I left. Not a call, not a message. Part of me wanted to believe they'd reach out, but I knew better. Pride was the only thing the Johnsons knew how to protect. One afternoon near the end of my shift at the diner, a familiar name came through on the order ticket. Henry Johnson, my grandfather, my father's father. I hadn't seen him in years. The family always said he was too opinionated, which was Robert's polite way of saying he didn't like being challenged. I brought his plate of roast beef and mashed potatoes to the booth myself. He looked older than I remembered. Thin, silver-haired, wearing an old army jacket and the same watch he'd worn when I was a kid. His eyes met mine, sharp and kind at the same time. "So it's true," he said. "You walked out." I nodded. "Yeah, didn't have much choice." He gestured for me to sit. "Your father hasn't changed, still blaming the world for his own shadow." I stayed quiet. He studied me for a long moment, then said, "So, what's the plan, boy?" "I got accepted to North Park University," I said. "Pre-med program, full scholarship. I just don't know if I can afford to live while studying. I'm working double shifts now." Henry leaned back. "Medicine, huh? Guess that fire runs deeper than your father thought." He pulled out a folded checkbook, wrote it out to North Park University for fees and books, and tore the page free. He slid it across the table. "This isn't charity. It's an investment. I'll cover your housing, books, and everything your scholarship doesn't. Treat it like a loan from God. Use it right, or I'll take it back." I blinked. "Why me?" He smiled faintly. "Because your father let fear define him. You don't have to. Someone in this family should finish what he couldn't." I didn't argue. I just nodded and said, "Thank you, Grandpa." He waved a hand. "Don't thank me yet. Prove me right." That night, I filled out my enrollment forms and officially accepted my place at North Park. The next few months moved fast. I moved closer to campus and registered for classes: biology, anatomy, psychology. The campus felt huge, full of people chasing their own versions of success. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was running toward it. Henry became my quiet mentor. He called every Sunday evening, never for long, always direct. "Keep your head down, don't chase approval, chase skill. Don't treat patients to impress them, treat them to understand them." Meanwhile, I heard small things about my family through whispers from old neighbors and news articles. My father had started drinking heavily again, showing up at charity events red-faced and loud. Daniel had become a minor celebrity in law school. Debate trophies, articles, interviews. My mother's name showed up in event photos, smiling beside people who didn't know her world was crumbling. I learned to stop checking. Their lives weren't mine anymore. North Park wasn't easy. There were moments I wanted to quit, when the bills piled up, when I failed a quiz after working a 12-hour shift, when I realized everyone else had safety nets, and I didn't. But I always remembered Henry's voice. "You can't control the storm. You can only keep walking through it." The months turned into a year. I earned near-perfect grades, kept my job at the diner on weekends, and volunteered at the university hospital's neurology wing. Watching patients regain speech and movement after injury fascinated me. The brain was fragile, but it could rebuild itself if given the right guidance. I saw hope in that. One night after midterms, I left the library close to midnight. As I crossed the parking lot, I noticed a familiar truck parked across the street. Inside, behind the fogged-up windshield, was Henry. He didn't call out or wave. He just sat there, lights off, watching the dorms. I knew why. He wanted to make sure I was still here, still fighting, still pushing forward. I raised a hand, and even from a distance I could see him nod once before starting the truck. He drove off slowly, disappearing into the dark. I stood there for a while, watching the taillights fade. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. 3 years passed faster than I expected, between classes, labs, and shifts at the diner. Sleep was something I traded for survival. My hands were always shaking from exhaustion, not nerves. but I got used to it. That was the cost of progress. North Park University wasn't gentle. Every day felt like a test of endurance. Anatomy labs bled into pharmacology lectures which rolled straight into study groups that lasted until sunrise. Most students complained. I didn't. I was there because someone believed in me, and I refused to waste that faith. My fascination with the brain started during sophomore year. The first time I watched a neurosurgery video in class, I couldn't look away. The complexity of it, the way thoughts, memories, and identity could all depend on a few centimeters of tissue, felt sacred. Neurology wasn't just science. It was mystery with rules. I started spending extra hours in the university hospital's neurology ward, volunteering at first, then shadowing doctors. Watching them diagnose patients who couldn't speak, move, or even understand their own reflection changed something in me. The more I saw, the more I realized how fragile people really were, and how precise you had to be to fix them. By my third year, professors knew my name. They noticed how I handled emergencies. One night during a hospital volunteer shift, a patient went into a seizure. The resident panicked, and I stepped in instinctively, clearing the airway, rolling the patient, keeping his vitals steady until help arrived. Afterward, the attending physician said, "You don't freeze under pressure. Keep that." I never forgot that line. Between labs and night classes, I still worked weekends at the diner. The pay barely covered rent, but it kept me grounded. Most nights were routine, coffee refills, noise, and tired faces. But one evening near the end of fall semester, everything shifted. The diner was packed. I was behind the counter cleaning up when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years, my mother's laugh. Sharp, deliberate, the same one she used at charity events when she wanted people to think she was happy. I looked up and there they were, my parents, sitting at a booth near the window. My father looked heavier, older, but his eyes hadn't changed, cold, controlling. My mother sat beside him in an expensive coat, her smile too bright for a place like this. A group from her charity event had apparently wandered in after a gala nearby. The sight of her in that setting was almost surreal. Polished jewelry and perfume cutting through the smell of grease and coffee. For a moment, I thought I could stay invisible, but then my father turned his head and froze. His jaw tightened. My mother followed his gaze and her face drained of color. "Ethan," she said quietly. Every table around them went silent. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over. "Evening." My father's voice carried across the diner. "So, this is what you left for? Serving tables?" People turned to look. His tone wasn't curious. It was venom. "Working," I said, "like everyone else here." He laughed, shaking his head. "You threw away your future for this." "I'm still in school," I said evenly. "North Park, pre-med." That hit him. His smirk vanished. "Still chasing that nonsense?" "Still chasing what matters," I said. My mother tried to calm him. "Robert, please." He ignored her. "You'll never make it. You don't have what it takes. Medicine demands respect, and you've already disgraced your own name." I looked around the diner, other workers watching, half afraid, half fascinated. I took a step closer and said quietly, "My name is the only thing you couldn't destroy." For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then I took their untouched check from the table and said, "This one's on me. Consider it my good deed for the year." I turned and walked away. My mother called after me, voice trembling, but I didn't look back. By the time I reached the back room, my pulse was steady again. Months passed. The workload grew heavier. Meanwhile, news of Daniel popped up occasionally. Articles about his early legal victories, his charm, his interviews. He looked confident, polished, untouchable, the kind of success my parents could show off again. I stopped reading after a while. Henry's calls grew less frequent. He said he was fine, just busy, but his voice sounded thinner each time. When I offered to visit, he brushed it off. "Don't worry about me, son, just keep doing the work." I knew what that meant. He didn't want me to see him aging. One evening, after another 14-hour day, I returned to my apartment to find a letter on the floor. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. "Henry." It read, "Ethan, a man's worth isn't in who praises him, but who he heals. You've already done more than most ever will. Keep going. H.J." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my wallet. That night, I studied until the sun began to rise, the city glowing gold outside my window. My reflection in the glass looked older, sharper, someone my father wouldn't recognize anymore. I had become everything he said I couldn't be, and I wasn't done yet. 15 years had passed since I left the Johnson house. I was 33 now, a neurologist at St. Francis Medical Center, known for handling complex autoimmune and cognitive disorders. My name was listed in journals, my patients trusted me, and I'd built a quiet reputation for solving cases others gave up on. I lived alone, worked long hours, and preferred it that way. The Johnsons were still a name people whispered about in the city. My father, Robert, had turned his bitterness into a full-time occupation. He gave lectures about ethics and surgical responsibility, as if rewriting his own history could erase what he'd done. My mother, Margaret, hid behind charity events and social circles that cared more about wine pairings than truth. And Daniel, he'd become everything they wanted. By 36, Daniel Johnson was a rising star in law, televised trials, talk show interviews, magazine covers calling him the iron mind of modern law. He had the charm, the confidence, the smile, everything that played well under bright lights. Then the cracks began to show. It started small, missed appointments, forgotten names, bursts of temper in meetings. People blamed stress. He was working high-profile cases. Burnout was expected. But then came the paranoia. Daniel accusing Kia workers of stealing his notes, claiming people were following him home. When his speech began to slip, simple words twisted or repeated, his firm forced him to take a break. Still, the family called it exhaustion. My father told reporters it was a private matter. My mother said he was just tired. They built the same wall of denial they'd always lived behind. Then one afternoon, during a televised court hearing, Daniel froze mid-argument. The footage played everywhere. One moment he was dismantling opposing counsel. The next, his face went blank. His eyes rolled back, his mouth moved with no sound, and then he dropped. That was the day the Johnsons' perfect image finally cracked. He was rushed to the hospital. No one could figure out what was wrong. MRI clean, toxicology negative, psychiatric evaluations contradictory. Some said early-onset schizophrenia. Others thought epilepsy or drug-induced psychosis. Every answer made him worse. Robert lashed out at every doctor who failed to fix his son. He accused hospitals of incompetence and malpractice, just as he once accused himself. Margaret barely left Daniel's bedside, pretending that faith could replace science. And Henry, my grandfather, watched from the sidelines. Older now, slower, but still the only man in that family who faced the truth. He knew this wasn't a scandal. It was another tragedy. When my phone rang that night, I was reviewing imaging results in my office. The number was unfamiliar, but I recognized the voice instantly. "Ethan," Henry said quietly. "It's time." I hadn't heard that tone in years. "What happened?" "It's Daniel," he said. "He's in Westbridge Hospital. They've had him there for weeks. No one knows what's wrong. Your father's ready to burn the place down and your mother's coming apart." I leaned back in my chair. "And you're calling me because they've run out of doctors," Henry said flatly. "And because you're the only one who might actually see the truth." I said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched thin between us. Finally, I asked, "Do they know you're calling me?" "Of course not," he said. "They'd rather die of pride than admit they need you. Which is why I'm not asking you to forgive them. I'm asking you to help your brother." I closed the file on my desk. "If I come, you keep my name out of it. They don't get to know it's me until I decide." "You have my word," Henry said. I flew to Westbridge the next morning. The hospital looked almost identical to the one where my father had once worked. Henry met me outside the ward. He looked frail but alert, leaning on a cane. "Room 314, he said. "They've tried everything, antipsychotics, antivirals, even ECT for suspected catatonia. It didn't touch the cause." When I stepped inside, I barely recognized Daniel. His hair was disheveled, his face pale, eyes darting as if tracking things no one else could see. He muttered words under his breath, half legal jargon, half nonsense. The hospital brought me in as an external consultant from St. Francis. Because he was family, I couldn't be the treating physician. I reviewed the data and advised the attending. They held the chart and signed every order. Compliance cleared me only if I wrote none. To stay invisible, my badge read consulting neurology, and the schedule listed E-roads. To the staff, I was just another flown-in specialist. None knew I'd grown up with the patient behind the glass. Daniel lay still, wrists lightly restrained for safety, skin pale, lips cracked, a feeding tube in place. The monitors kept a steady metronome. The courtroom presence was gone, replaced by a body that twitched when the brain misfired. 34 physicians had tried. Neuropsych, medicine. Scans were normal. Treatments conflicted. The pattern was there. No one had stayed long enough to connect it. Over the next 40 to 8 hours, I rebuilt the case from scratch. I went through every MRI, EEG, and spinal fluid result. What caught my attention wasn't what was in the reports, but what wasn't. The antibody screening had been skipped twice due to low likelihood. That mistake had almost killed him. I recommended a full autoimmune panel and asked the team to schedule another spinal tap. When the results came back, the numbers confirmed what I already suspected: anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, a rare disorder where the immune system attacks the brain's receptors, hijacking thought, speech, and memory. Left untreated, it mimicked madness. This is what people call brain on fire. The treatment protocol was clear: high-dose steroids, intravenous immunoglobulin, and round-the-clock monitoring. I presented the plan to the attending, who signed the orders. By the second week, I lived almost entirely inside that ward. Nurses learned to leave coffee on my desk instead of conversation. I monitored Daniel's vitals every few hours, recommended medication adjustments, and documented every flicker of response in my consult notes. When the tremors began to lessen, I knew we were turning a corner. Henry visited once, moving slowly down the hall with his cane. He didn't enter the room. He just watched through the window until I stepped out. "You've become the man this family needed," he said. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I shook my head. "I'm just doing my job." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly what your father used to say, back when he still remembered what the job was." We stood in silence, separated by decades of Johnson history neither of us could fix. Then Henry said, "When he wakes up, let them think it was luck. You don't owe them the truth yet." "I know," I said. He squeezed my arm once and left. The days blended together. Progress was slow but visible. Daniel's eyes started following movement. His fingers twitched in rhythm with voices. The EEG spikes softened, and the hallucinations faded. Every milestone was a reminder of how far gone he'd been, and how close I'd come to being too late. The steroids made him weak. The treatments left him dazed, but his mind was slowly clawing its way back. I refused to think about the past. Each shift, I reminded myself that my duty was to the patient, not the bloodline. The chart didn't list him as brother, just male, 36, autoimmune encephalitis. I treated him like any other case. That was the only way I could keep my focus. The nurses began to whisper about the mysterious doctor who barely left his patient's side. I ignored the rumors. The work mattered more than appearances. Around 2 a.m., the ward held its breath. I sat by Daniel's bed and worked through the day's labs. Breathing steady, pulse stronger. I tweaked the 4 and checked his pupils, reactive, slow but there. A nurse stepped in. "You've been here 18 hours, Dr. Rhodes. Go home. He'll be stable tonight." "I'm fine," I said, still watching the monitor. She nodded and slipped out. When I finally looked at him again, his eyelids flickered. A small movement, almost nothing, but enough to make me freeze. He shifted his head slightly toward the light. The reflex was subtle but deliberate. I leaned closer. "Daniel." No response, just a faint exhale, but his eyes opened. Unfocused at first, then searching. He looked past me, scanning the ceiling, the machines, the unfamiliar room. I could tell he recognized nothing. His lips parted soundlessly, like he was trying to remember how to form words. "You're safe," I said quietly. "Don't try to talk. Just breathe." He blinked twice, slow and uneven, but it was a blink of comprehension, the first real sign of awareness. I noted the reaction on the chart, then stood for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest. This was the beginning of recovery, the point where the body stopped fighting and started listening again. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, catching the edge of his profile. For a brief second, I saw traces of the brother I'd grown up with, the one who mocked, competed, and believed he'd never fall. Now he was fragile, human, and quiet. I leaned closer, my voice low enough for only him to hear. "You're going to make it." His eyes fluttered once, as if he'd heard me through the fog. I turned off the desk lamp and left the room. The hallway outside smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain drifting in from a cracked window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of resentment pressing against my chest. I'd come back to heal a man who'd never wanted me in his life, but in the stillness of that ward it didn't matter anymore. The job was to bring him back, and that, finally, was happening. 3 weeks later, Daniel's recovery had crossed the turning point. His vitals were stable, the hallucinations gone, and he could form sentences again. His mind wasn't whole yet, but the storm had passed. The hospital's administration decided it was time to brief the family. A meeting was scheduled for the following morning. I'd avoided them this long, keeping my name buried under layers of protocol, but it couldn't stay hidden forever. The attending physician insisted that the consulting neurologist, me, be present for the final review. I didn't object. Some truths needed to be faced in person. The conference room on the third floor was sterile and cold, with one long table under harsh fluorescent light. I was the first to arrive. I stood at the far end, reviewing Daniel's test results one last time, the scans showing remission, the antibody levels returning to normal, the proof of what medicine could do when fear didn't get in the way. The door opened. Margaret entered first, wrapped in an elegant coat far too formal for a hospital. She looked older, brittle, the shine gone from her eyes. Behind her came Robert, leaning on his cane, still carrying that air of superiority even as defeat clung to him like a shadow. Daniel followed, leaning on the nurse. Every few steps looked like a negotiation with gravity. They didn't recognize me. I still had my mask and cap from rounds. Infection control on the ward made it routine. As the head nurse introduced me, "This is the consulting neurologist who oversaw the case. He'll explain the recovery plan." The attending physician took a seat halfway down the table, leafing through Daniel's chart as I set out the scans. I nodded once and began. Mr. Johnson suffered from anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, an autoimmune disorder that targets the brain. It causes inflammation, disrupting memory, speech, and perception. Untreated, it can lead to permanent damage or death. They listened in silence. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. Daniel's eyes stayed on the floor. Robert's jaw tightened as if holding back something he couldn't name. "The treatment involved high-dose steroids and immunotherapy," I continued. "He's responding well, but his recovery will take months. The brain needs time to rebuild." I paused, then added, "If it had gone on any longer, we wouldn't be sitting here." When I finished outlining the plan, the attending closed the chart and said, "I'll give you a few minutes." He stepped out, leaving me with the family. Robert shifted forward. "Doctor," he said, his voice rough. "May I ask your name?" I reached up and removed my mask. Silence. Margaret's breath caught audibly. Her eyes widened, disbelief turning to shock. Robert froze completely, one hand gripping the edge of the table. Daniel looked up and blinked several times, as if trying to convince himself he wasn't hallucinating again. "Hello," I said evenly. "It's been a long time." No one spoke. The room seemed to shrink around us. Finally, Robert found his voice, rough and broken. "Ethan." I nodded once. "Your son's alive. That's what matters." Robert sank into the nearest chair, his face ashen. "You saved him. After everything we did to you?" His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow breath, steady and deliberate. "I did my job. That's all." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. I was wrong, Ethan. I was wrong about you, about everything." Margaret reached out weakly. "We thought we were protecting you." I met her eyes. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting the lie that your pride mattered more than your children." Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You could have walked away." "I almost did," I said. "But I took an oath to heal, not to choose who deserves it." Robert buried his face in his hands. The sound of his breathing filled the room. Margaret began to cry silently beside him. Daniel sat still, expression unreadable. After a long pause, Robert looked up. "Ethan, can you forgive us?" I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of his question settle. Then I said, calm but firm, "You don't earn forgiveness by asking. You earn it by changing." He nodded slowly, his shoulders collapsing. For the first time, I saw the man behind the arrogance, a father crushed by the cost of his own mistakes. I gathered the folder from the table and closed it. "The staff will continue his care. I've already transferred my notes to the attending physician." Margaret tried to stand, reaching out as if to stop me. "Ethan, please wait." But I didn't. I walked to the door. Behind me, Robert called my name once, voice breaking. "Ethan." I stopped for half a second but didn't turn around. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. For the first time, there was no anger in his tone, just truth. I kept walking. Outside, the hallway was empty except for the soft hum of hospital lights. I pulled the mask back over my face and passed the nurse's station without a word. Through the glass wall, I saw my reflection, older, calm, untouchable. In the room behind me, my family sat in silence, facing the wreckage they'd built with their own hands. I didn't need to see their faces to know what came next. Guilt, grief, realization. The storm they'd unleashed years ago had finally come full circle, and this time, I wasn't the one drowning in it. I walked out of the hospital into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in muted gold. I took a slow breath, steady, clean. For the first time since I was 18, the name Johnson didn't feel like a curse. It was just a story I'd outgrown. Months passed. The world outside the hospital moved on. But inside the Johnson family, time slowed. Daniel's recovery was steady but fragile. He could walk, speak, and remember most things. But the sharp edge of arrogance that once defined him was gone. He'd become quiet, deliberate, a man learning how to live without applause. Robert, for the first time in decades, began therapy. Word of it reached me through Henry. Margaret wrote to me every few weeks, short messages. "I hope you're eating well. Daniel asks about you. Your father is trying." I read them all but never replied. Some things didn't need closure. They needed distance. Henry stayed in touch. Even when his voice grew weaker, he never missed our weekly calls. One afternoon he said, "The family's finally seeing what you've always known. That truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." I smiled through the phone. "You taught me that." He chuckled. "No, you learned it on your own. I just reminded you who you were." A week later, he called again. His tone was calm, but there was something final in it. "Ethan, I'm inviting everyone for dinner one last time." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. The dinner was held at his house on the outskirts of town, a modest home, clean, quiet, filled with the smell of oak and thyme. It was the first time all 5 of us had been in the same room in 15 years. Robert arrived first, walking slower but straighter. Margaret followed, composed but hesitant, as if the walls themselves remembered too much. Daniel came last, hands in his pockets, still thinner than before but steady on his feet. I stood by the window until Henry motioned for me to sit. He looked frail but sharp-eyed, his white hair neatly combed, his cane resting beside the table. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, and black coffee. No one spoke much. The silence wasn't heavy. It was careful, like everyone was afraid to break something fragile. Halfway through the meal, Henry set down his fork and cleared his throat. "I'm not going to make a speech," he began. "I just have something to say before time catches up." All eyes turned toward him. He looked at Robert first. "You built your life on precision, boy. You thought one mistake erased who you were. It didn't. It just showed you what kind of man you'd rather not be. Took you long enough to face that." Robert nodded silently, eyes lowered. And Henry looked at Margaret. "You spent your life pretending peace was the same thing as silence. But peace doesn't come from pretending. It comes from truth. You've got a chance to make peace now. Use it." Margaret's lips pressed together, and a tear slid down her cheek. When he turned to Daniel, his tone softened. "You were raised to think you were untouchable. Life fixed that for you. Don't waste the lesson." Daniel gave a small, broken nod. "I won't." Finally, Henry's gaze landed on me. "And you, Ethan, you did what no one else in this family ever could. You left, you built, and you came back without letting hate follow you." I said quietly, "I didn't do it alone." He smiled faintly. "No, you didn't. But you were the one who kept walking." He leaned back, his breath unsteady but eyes clear. "When your father disowned you, I made a promise to myself to never let you face that road without a hand to hold you up. I couldn't be your father, but I could be the voice that told you to keep going." The room stayed silent. Even Robert didn't interrupt. Henry looked around the table one last time. "I brought you all here not to make peace, but to remind you what it costs when pride replaces love. The Johnson name used to mean something in medicine, law, and reputation. Now it should mean something in forgiveness. You can start that without me." He stood slowly, leaning on his cane. That's all I needed to say. No one spoke for the rest of the evening. We finished the meal quietly. When I left, Henry hugged me tighter than he ever had. "Don't wait for them to understand you," he said. "Just keep being you." That was the last time I saw him alive. Henry passed away 2 weeks later in his sleep. His lawyer contacted me after the funeral. In his will, he left me a portion of his estate, not for myself, but for something he called unfinished work. The letter that came with it said, "Use this to give another kid the chance you never got. Call it what you want, but make sure my name reminds them that faith can build what pride destroys. I used the money to start a scholarship foundation for students disowned for choosing their own path. I called it the Henry Johnson Trust. On my next shift, I arrived at the hospital before dawn. The city was quiet, the streets washed clean by night rain. I stood outside for a moment, coat slung over my arm, watching the first lights spill over the skyline. The morning air carried the faint hum of life, the sound of cars starting, people waking, the pulse of a world moving forward. I thought about the letter my father tore all those years ago, the one that started everything. They tore my letter once, I murmured to myself. But every life I save writes it back. Line by line, the sun climbed higher, cutting through the last of the shadows. I slipped on my coat, turned toward the hospital doors, and walked inside, steady, healed, and unafraid.